Life of the Sioux, Part 1. Imagine the endless grasslands of the Great Plains, a horizon so wide that the sky itself feels like a great dome, stretching forever, painted with shifting clouds and golden sunlight. Herds of bison move like dark rivers across the prairie. The wind whistles low through tall grasses, carrying the smell of earth and sage. In this vast land lived one of the most famous native nations in American history, the Sioux. When we speak of the Sioux, we must remember, this name is not just a single tribe. It's a great nation, a confederation of peoples who shared language, culture, and history. They often called themselves Dakota, Lakota, or Nakota, depending on the dialect. Sioux was a name given by outsiders, but among themselves, they were the allies, the people. In the heart of the 18th and 19th centuries, the Sioux lived as nomadic hunters and gatherers across the Great Plains, stretching from present-day Minnesota and Wisconsin to the Dakotas, Nebraska, and into Montana. But their life was not simply about survival. It was about harmony with nature, with animals, with the spirits that they believed lived in every part of the world. To understand their daily life, we first must understand their vision of the universe. For the Sioux, life was not divided between the sacred and the ordinary. Everything was sacred. The bison that fed them, the sun that warmed them, the thunder that rolled across the plains, each was alive with spiritual power. They spoke of Wakantanka, often translated as the Great Spirit or Great Mystery. This was not just one god in the European sense, but rather the sum of all sacred things, all life, all creation. The Sioux believed that humans were only one small part of this great web. To live well meant to live in balance. This worldview shaped every choice. Before a hunt, warriors prayed. Before eating, families gave thanks. Before a child was born, elders prepared songs and ceremonies to welcome that new life into the sacred circle. Now imagine yourself walking into a Sioux camp in the 1800s. What would you see? First, the circle of teepees, rising like white cones against the grass. The Sioux always built their camps in a circle, symbolizing the great circle of life. In the center, there might be a council fire, a place where leaders gathered to make decisions, where storytellers entertained, and where sacred ceremonies unfolded. Inside each teepee lived a family, parents, children, sometimes grandparents. A Sioux teepee was more than shelter. It was a home carefully designed for mobility and balance. Made from long poles of lodgepole pine covered with buffalo hides, it could be raised or taken down in less than an hour. That was important, because the Sioux followed the movement of the bison, packing up their homes and belongings whenever the herds moved. Family life was filled with warmth, teaching, and responsibility. Children were deeply loved, yet they were also taught independence from a young age. A boy might receive his first small bow as soon as he could walk steadily. A girl might begin learning how to tan hides or sew beads before she was 10. Elders played a central role, passing down wisdom, stories, and songs that carried the memory of generations. Life in the Sioux Nation had clear roles for men and women, but those roles were equally respected. Men were often hunters and warriors. They provided food and defended the camp. But women held power too. They owned the teepees, controlled the household, and were masters of artistry in beadwork, quillwork, and clothing. A man might bring home a buffalo, but it was the women who transformed it into life, food, clothing, rope, tools, even toys for children. A single buffalo could provide hundreds of uses, and nothing went to waste. The women were also the keepers of family stories and traditions, ensuring that each generation carried the values of courage, generosity, and respect. To the Sioux, no animal was more sacred than the buffalo. Imagine standing on a ridge, looking out at thousands of them moving across the prairie. Their hooves thundered like drums. Their presence meant food, shelter, and survival. Buffalo hunts were not just economic events, they were spiritual. Before a hunt, leaders would meet in council. Scouts were sent to locate the herds. Prayers were offered, songs sung, tobacco smoked as an offering to the spirits. When the hunt began, every rider knew their role. The goal was not to slaughter aimlessly but to take only what the people needed. From buffalo came meat for food, hides for teepees and clothing, sinew for thread, bones for tools, horns for cups and spoons, fat for cooking. Even the stomach could be cleaned and used as a container. In return, the Sioux honored the spirit of the buffalo through stories and ceremonies. One of the most sacred stories was of the white buffalo calf woman, who gave the Sioux their most important ceremonial object, the sacred pipe. The Sioux pipe was no ordinary smoking tool. It was a link between humans and the sacred world. When a pipe was lifted to the sky, it was as though prayers rose with the smoke, traveling to the great mystery. Ceremonies around the pipe were central to Sioux identity. Councils used it when making important decisions. Families used it in times of crisis or joy. Warriors carried it into battle. The pipe symbolized peace, unity, and the promise that people would live in balance with the world around them. Other ceremonies marked the seasons. The sun dance, for example, was the most powerful ritual, held in summer when the people gathered in great camps. Dancers fasted and prayed, sometimes piercing their skin to show their sacrifice for the health of the people. To the Sioux, suffering willingly was a way of giving strength back to the community. If you had been a Sioux child, your education would not have taken place in a classroom with books and chalkboards. Instead, the prairie was your classroom, and every adult was your teacher. You would learn by watching, by listening, by doing. A boy might follow his father or uncles on a hunt, practicing how to move silently, how to track an animal, how to shoot an arrow with precision. A girl might sit beside her mother or grandmother, learning how to prepare hides, how to cook over an open fire, how to decorate clothing with beads and patterns that carried meaning. But children also learned values. Through stories told at night by the fire, they learned lessons about bravery, generosity, and humility. Through games, they built skills, running, wrestling, throwing. A child's education was lifelong, and it was designed to make them strong, capable, and respectful members of the tribe. Of course, the Sioux are often remembered in American memory as fierce warriors. And indeed, courage was one of their highest virtues. But courage was not just about fighting enemies. It was about living honorably. To be a warrior meant to protect the people, to stand for justice, and to show bravery in the face of hardship. Raids against enemy tribes were common, not always for conquest but often for counting coup, a practice where the bravest warriors would touch an enemy with a hand or a stick and escape unharmed. To touch without killing showed supreme courage. Warriors earned feathers for their deeds, each feather a record of bravery. Headdresses covered in eagle feathers were not costumes, they were living histories, each feather telling a story of honor and sacrifice. At the heart of Sioux life was the circle. The circle of the teepee. The circle of the camp. The circle of the seasons, the ceremonies, the generations. They believed that life itself was a great circle, without beginning, without end. Birth, growth, death, and renewal were all parts of this sacred pattern. To live in the circle meant to live with respect, respect for the earth, for animals, for ancestors, for children yet to come. This idea shaped their laws, their customs, their art, and their spirituality. So in this first part of our journey into the life of the Sioux, we've walked into their camps, listened to their worldview, tasted their food, felt the thunder of the buffalo, and sat by the sacred pipe. We've seen how families lived, how children were raised, how warriors sought honor, and how the people found meaning in every breath of wind, every ray of sun, every heartbeat of the earth. But this is only the beginning. In Part 2, we will explore how the Sioux faced the storms of history, how trade, war, and the arrival of European settlers changed their world forever. The Sioux way of life was built on harmony with the land. But soon, forces far beyond their control would shake that harmony, testing their strength, unity, and survival. Part 2. When we last left the Sioux, we were standing with them in the circle of their camps, listening to the voices of elders, watching children learn, and hearing the thunder of buffalo hooves. But history never stands still. The 18th and 19th centuries brought enormous change. The Sioux, like many native nations, found themselves swept into the storms of trade, migration, and the growing tide of settlers pushing west. This was the age when the Sioux rose to become one of the most powerful nations on the Great Plains, and also the age when their way of life was most challenged. To understand the transformation of the Sioux, we must begin with the horse. Horses were not native to North America. Spanish explorers had brought them centuries earlier, and over time, they spread northward, traded from tribe to tribe, sometimes escaping and forming wild herds. For the Sioux, who once lived primarily in the woodlands near the Great Lakes, the horse changed everything. By the 1700s, they had migrated westward onto the open plains, where the horse became their closest partner. Picture a Sioux warrior riding bareback at full speed, his body moving as one with the horse, bow drawn, arrow flying toward a buffalo. Suddenly the hunt became faster, more efficient, more daring. Horses also transformed warfare. Raids could cover vast distances. Enemies could be struck quickly, then left behind in the dust. The Sioux became true masters of the plains, their identity forever tied to the horse. Horses were wealth, pride, freedom, and they became woven into songs, dances, and ceremonies. But horses were not the only change. By the mid-1700s, European traders, French, then British, later American, were reaching deeper into Sioux territory. They came with goods that dazzled, metal pots, rifles, beads, cloth. In exchange, they wanted furs, especially beaver pelts, prized in Europe for hats. Later, buffalo hides became the main commodity, used in factories back east. The Sioux, skilled hunters, became part of this vast fur trade network. At first, it seemed like a good exchange. A steel knife cut better than bone. A rifle had more power than a bow. But these goods also tied the Sioux into a system controlled by distant markets. Traders demanded more hides. The Sioux hunted more than ever, not only for their own needs but to meet trade quotas. Slowly, balance with nature began to shift. As the Sioux expanded westward onto the plains, they encountered other nations, the Crow, the Pawnee, the Iroquois, the Ojibwe, and many more. Competition for hunting grounds and trade routes brought frequent conflict. The Sioux were fierce fighters, and their numbers grew strong. They built powerful alliances among their own divisions, the Dakota in the east, the Nakota in the Central Plains, and the Lakota in the west. United, they dominated vast territories stretching across the Dakotas, Nebraska, Montana, and Wyoming. Raids were not always about destruction. They were often about horses, honor, and territory. But they shaped Sioux identity as warriors. Songs celebrated victories. Feathers marked brave deeds. Young men sought to prove themselves in these conflicts, knowing that courage was the path to respect. By the early 1800s, new forces pressed in. The United States, having won independence, began its westward expansion. Settlers poured into lands once considered too wild, driven by dreams of farms, gold, and new beginnings. The Sioux watched as wagons rolled across their hunting grounds. Rivers once used for fishing became highways of settlement. Forests and prairies shrank. The bison herds, once numbering in the tens of millions, began to thin under relentless hunting, not only by natives but by market hunters supplying distant cities. At first, some Sioux tried to adapt. They traded, they negotiated treaties. But those treaties were often broken or misunderstood, written in languages unfamiliar to Sioux leaders, signed under pressure. Piece by piece, land was ceded. Perhaps no place was more sacred to the Sioux than the Black Hills, known as Pahasapa. Rising from the plains in present-day South Dakota, these forested hills were the heart of their spiritual world. They believed the Black Hills were a place of creation, where humans first came into being. For centuries, Sioux bands returned there for ceremonies, vision quests, and gathering strength. The hills were rich in game, streams, and timber. To lose them was unthinkable. But by the mid-1800s, settlers and miners began pushing into the Black Hills, especially after rumors of gold spread. What was sacred to the Sioux became a target for outsiders seeking fortune. This clash would ignite some of the most famous conflicts in American history. Even as these pressures mounted, Sioux daily life continued. Families still moved with the seasons, following the bison. Women still created clothing from hides, decorated with stunning beadwork that told stories in color and pattern. Men still hunted, still rode into battle, still gathered in councils. Children still learned through stories, games, and example. But there was a growing sense of uncertainty. Would the buffalo always be there? Would the land remain theirs? Elders warned of the dangers of forgetting traditions. At the same time, younger generations saw rifles, railroads, and cities rising on the horizon. Life became a balancing act between preserving the old ways and adapting to survive the new. As settlers moved west, the U.S. Army followed. Forts were built across Sioux lands. Soldiers patrolled trails and rivers. Encounters between soldiers and Sioux warriors often ended in bloodshed. For the Sioux, the presence of the army was both a challenge and an insult. These were their lands, promised in treaties, yet soldiers now enforced foreign rules. Skirmishes grew into battles. The Sioux, skilled fighters on horseback, often won stunning victories. But the army had endless reinforcements, supplies, and new weapons. The balance of power was shifting, and the Sioux knew it. It was during this turbulent time that some of the most famous Sioux leaders emerged. Sitting Bull, Crazy Horse, Red Cloud, names that would echo through history. Each embodied the spirit of the Sioux in different ways. Red Cloud was a diplomat and a warrior. He led his people in Red Cloud's war during the 1860s, forcing the U.S. to abandon forts along the Bozeman Trail, a rare native victory. Sitting Bull, a Lakota holy man, became the voice of resistance, a leader who inspired his people through visions and spiritual strength. Crazy Horse was the warrior's warrior, fearless in battle, determined to protect his people at all costs. Together, they became symbols of Sioux resistance, guiding their nation through some of its darkest and most heroic moments. As pressures mounted, Sioux spirituality became even more vital. The pipe was still smoked, the sun dance still performed, the circle still honored. But new visions began to emerge. Prophets spoke of unity, of a coming storm, of the need to hold fast to traditions. Some Sioux saw adaptation as survival, engaging in trade, sending children to schools, learning the ways of outsiders. Others saw adaptation as surrender. To give up the old ways was to lose the soul of the people. This tension would grow sharper in the years ahead, leading to divisions within Sioux communities and shaping their response to the crises of the late 19th century. By the mid-1800s, the Sioux still commanded respect across the plains. They were powerful, numerous, feared by enemies. Yet storm clouds were gathering. The buffalo herds were shrinking at an alarming rate. Settlers kept coming, backed by soldiers and railroads. Treaties were broken, lands taken, promises ignored. The Sioux faced a question that cut to the heart of their identity: could they remain free people of the plains, riding with the buffalo, living by the circle of life? Or would they be forced into reservations, cut off from their traditions, made strangers in their own homeland? The answer would come in the form of legendary battles, broken treaties, and one of the most tragic chapters in American history. In this second part of our journey, we've watched the Sioux rise with the power of the horse, trade with distant markets, clash with neighboring tribes, and face the growing wave of settlers. We've seen the sacred Black Hills threatened, leaders rise to defend their people, and the army march onto the plains. The Sioux stood at a crossroads. Their world was changing faster than ever before. The choices they made, and the battles they fought, would shape not only their future but the history of the United States itself. In Part 3, we will enter the dramatic years of open war, the clashes with the U.S. Army, the triumph at the Battle of the Little Bighorn, the tragedies of broken treaties, and the long struggle for survival as the Sioux faced the end of the buffalo and the dawn of a new, uncertain era. Part 3. The Sioux had risen to power on the Great Plains. They mastered the horse, they commanded the buffalo, and their warriors were respected and feared across the West. But by the second half of the 19th century, the winds of history were no longer in their favor. The American frontier was closing in, and with it came armies, settlers, and railroads. The struggle of the Sioux in these years would become both legendary and tragic, a story of courage, loss, and survival against overwhelming odds. By the 1870s, the buffalo herds that had once numbered in the tens of millions were disappearing at an astonishing rate. Railroads brought hunters from the east who killed for sport or profit, leaving carcasses to rot. Some military officers even encouraged the slaughter, knowing that if the buffalo were gone, native nations like the Sioux would have no choice but to move on to reservations. For the Sioux, this was more than an economic disaster. It was spiritual devastation. The buffalo was at the heart of their way of life, their ceremonies, their very identity. Imagine watching the great herds vanish, each year fewer and fewer, until at last only scattered remnants remained. Without buffalo, hunger spread through Sioux camps. Families that had once thrived on the bounty of the plains now struggled to survive. This collapse fueled anger, despair, and a fierce determination to resist. The breaking point came in the 1870s, when gold was discovered in the Black Hills. Despite treaties guaranteeing that land to the Sioux, miners flooded in, backed by the U.S. government. When the Sioux resisted, the army marched to force them onto reservations. This conflict became known as the Great Sioux War of 1876–77. The Sioux were not alone. They fought alongside the Northern Cheyenne and Arapaho. Warriors gathered under leaders like Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse, determined to protect their sacred lands and their freedom. In June 1876, the Sioux and their allies achieved their most famous victory. Along the Little Bighorn River in Montana, thousands of native warriors faced the 7th Cavalry under Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer. Picture the scene, the summer sun blazing, teepees stretching across the valley, families startled by the sudden attack. Custer divided his men, underestimating the strength of the Sioux and Cheyenne. What followed was fierce, chaotic, and decisive. Led by warriors like Crazy Horse, the native forces overwhelmed Custer's command. In less than an hour, Custer and more than 200 of his men were dead. For the Sioux, it was a moment of triumph, proof that courage and unity could defeat even the most modern army. But victory carried a heavy shadow. The United States responded with overwhelming force. Soldiers poured into the plains, determined to crush native resistance once and for all. After Little Bighorn, the Sioux knew the storm was coming. Food was scarce, the army was relentless, and the buffalo were gone. Many bands surrendered, forced onto reservations. Crazy Horse, however, refused to give up easily. He led his followers through harsh winters, avoiding capture, still fighting for freedom. But by 1877, starvation made resistance impossible. Crazy Horse finally surrendered. That same year, under mysterious circumstances, he was killed while in army custody. His death struck a blow to Sioux resistance. One of their greatest warriors, a man who had never signed a treaty, was gone. Even after Crazy Horse's death, hope for renewal remained. In the late 1880s, a spiritual movement called the Ghost Dance swept across native nations. It promised that if the people danced and prayed, the buffalo would return, the white settlers would vanish, and life would be restored to how it had been before. For the Sioux, starving on reservations, this vision was powerful. They gathered in circles, singing, dancing, wearing shirts they believed could repel bullets. Sitting Bull, still a respected spiritual leader, supported the movement. The U.S. authorities, however, saw the Ghost Dance as a threat, a possible uprising. In 1890, they ordered Sitting Bull's arrest. During the attempt, he was shot and killed. The Sioux had lost another of their most revered leaders. The tragedy did not end there. In December 1890, a band of Sioux, many of them followers of the ghost dance, were moving toward the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota. Exhausted, cold, and hungry, they camped near Wounded Knee Creek. The U.S. Army surrounded them. Tensions rose. A gun went off, no one knows from which side. Chaos erupted. Soldiers opened fire with rifles and Hotchkiss guns. In minutes, hundreds of Sioux men, women, and children lay dead in the snow. The massacre at Wounded Knee marked the end of armed Sioux resistance. It was the closing chapter of the Indian Wars, leaving behind grief that would echo for generations. After Wounded Knee, the Sioux were confined to reservations. The government imposed new rules: farming instead of hunting, English instead of Lakota, Christianity instead of traditional ceremonies. Children were taken to boarding schools, stripped of their language and culture. Life was harsh. Poverty and hunger were constant. Yet the Sioux endured. Families held on to their stories, their songs, their traditions in secret. Elders whispered the old ways so that the circle of life would not be broken. Despite the tragedies, the Sioux people survived. In the 20th century, they began reclaiming their identity. Ceremonies once banned were revived. The sun dance returned. Language programs taught young people to speak Lakota again. Leaders fought legal battles to restore land and sovereignty, including the sacred Black Hills, which remain disputed to this day. The Sioux became not only survivors but symbols. Their history of resistance inspired generations of native and non-native people alike to value freedom, dignity, and cultural pride. Today, Sioux nations remain across North and South Dakota, Nebraska, Minnesota, and Montana, with communities that continue to honor their ancestors. Modern life may include cars, smartphones, and schools, but in ceremonies, powwows, and family gatherings, the heartbeat of the old ways is still strong. The Sioux story is not one of defeat, but of resilience. From the days of buffalo hunts and horse warriors to the struggles of reservations and the renewal of traditions, the Sioux remind us that culture and spirit cannot be erased. They are still here. Their circle continues. In this final part of our journey, we have walked with the Sioux through their greatest battles and their deepest tragedies. We've stood on the field of Little Bighorn, wept at Wounded Knee, and seen the long road of survival that followed. The Sioux story is America's story, a story of expansion and loss, of courage and resilience, of tragedy and hope. And though the old days of buffalo hunts are gone, the spirit of the Sioux still rides the wind of the Great Plains, whispering to all who listen. Remember. Honor. Endure. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. Don't forget to hit that notification bell so you don't miss any future uploads.